大家好，欢迎来到我的小博客. Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Victoria and I'm a language lover and a teacher of Chinese as a foreign language. Subscribe to this channel if you're learning Chinese or just planning to start. I share weekly tips and insights about the language here. So, over the past few years, Chinese has been getting crazily popular despite its proverbial difficulty for learners, so let's see what people ask about it. Why is Chinese language called Mandarin? This is a very good question. Historically, Mandarin refers to a dialect that was used by officials in China, Guanhua. And now Mandarin refers to the dialect that was picked as an official standard language of China. The word Mandarin refers to the officials in the Chinese imperial court and most likely comes from the Portuguese word mandar, which means to command, to order, and so Mandarin is the one who commands. Why is Chinese language of the future? Well, I know lots of people who would disagree with this claim. For one thing, it's very difficult to learn, and for this reason only, it's very unlikely to replace English as the language of global communication in any foreseeable future. Its current writing system does not allow you to read a text unless you learned each and every character in this text before. So it's very unlikely that Chinese or any non-alphabetic language is going to become a truly global language. That being said, the role of Chinese, of course, growing, especially in Asia and Africa. China is investing a lot in those regions. So knowing Chinese on par with English puts you at a greater advantage on the job market in those regions. Also, China is a huge trading partner for the countries worldwide, so companies that work with China also prefer people with Chinese language skills. At the same time, any Chinese company that is dealing with foreigners has people who speak English, so communication is still most likely gonna be in English. That's why there is really a lot to consider before you dub Chinese the language of the future. It is definitely gonna grow in popularity regionally, and China is doing a lot to promote its language abroad, but it is still too far-fetched to say that Chinese is gonna replace English as the language of global communication in the foreseeable future. Why is Chinese so hard to learn? This is a great question and I have a lot to say about it. So Chinese is listed among the most difficult languages to learn for English speakers, and I would say for any speaker whose mother tongue is not a tonal language and does not use Chinese characters, and that is like 99% of the languages. Strictly speaking, there are several reasons that make it so difficult. Yes, we all know that it is harder to write Chinese characters compared to, say, Latin alphabet, but that's not just it. It's not just the intricate characters. The problem with non-alphabetic languages is that there is no way to know how to read a character unless you learned it at some point in the past, which effectively means that you cannot read a text aloud if you didn't learn every single character in the text, if you don't know how to pronounce every single character in the text. Just imagine reading an English or a French text. Yeah, you don't know some words, but you know the letters. There is a very limited number of letters. You know the reading rules, so you can read the text, even though you may miss some of the meanings of the words. But in Chinese, you simply stop in your tracks every time you meet a character that you didn't learn in the past, or that you learned, but you go like, I know I've seen this, but I still don't remember how to read it. And this happens all the time, no matter how long you've been learning a language. Just give a newspaper to a person who has proficiency in Chinese and ask him to read an article aloud, and I wonder how many lines they can read without stopping and saying, I don't know this character. If they can make it to the 10th line, to the 15th line, that means they are super cool. Okay, so the writing system is one thing, but there's more. Another thing is that Chinese is a tonal language, which means that syllables pronounced with different pitch of your voice have different meanings. And it takes a learner quite some time to train their ear to hear that 解释 and 结实 are two different words. The craziest example of this is a famous poem which consists of only one syllable with different tones. Just listen to a bit of it. 史是诗是诗是史诗事实史诗事实史事是事诗 Listening comprehension for learners is hindered not only by the tones but also by a huge number of homophones. Chinese has a very limited toolbox of syllables. There are 413 syllables. Almost every syllable consists of an initial and a final, and there are only these few possible combinations. So the first impression that you hear from a learner who's been studying Chinese for, say, several months is gonna be like, everything sounds so freakishly the same. I have a student who says that if you don't know how to read a character, just try 是 and you're gonna be right 9 out of 10. So this huge number of homophones and near homophones that differ only in tones make it devilishly hard to learn for those who've never dealt with tonal languages before. And after all, any language is the reflection of the culture, and we have this huge cultural gap with China. How many Chinese books can you name? How many Chinese writers, actors, singers, bloggers can you name? And they most likely never watched your favorite TV shows, never heard your favorite songs, and never watched YouTube. So this cultural gap is another reason why we struggle so hard to understand them and to make our thoughts clear to them. Okay, this was a long one. Let's go to the next question. Why is Chinese spoken most in the world? Well, this is easy, because China is the biggest country in terms of population, and Chinese language has the biggest number of native speakers, that is about 1.3 billion people. At the same time, if you also count non-native speakers, of course, English is going to be the most spoken in the world. Why is Chinese a tonal language? This is also a great question. Chinese phonetic system is quite unique. It has a very limited number of sound combinations, so there is a need to distinguish such a huge number of homophones. And this is where tones come in handy. If for us learners, tones are a huge pain in the ass, they all seem the same, actually they are very helpful to decrease ambiguity. They help us differentiate the words which otherwise would have been absolutely identical. Historically, the theory has it that ancient Chinese did not have tones, but it had codas.
Wait, what?
Which is a slight ending to a syllable, kind of as if you start pronouncing a consonant at the end of the syllable and don't finish it. Like Cantonese, for example, still has it.
Zap, sup, nup, tap, sup, lup, lup.
So people who reconstruct the way ancient Chinese sounded, which is a very tricky task, so they believe that at some point Chinese started to drop these codas and develop tones instead to decrease ambiguity when too many words started to sound the same. Okay, so the next question is, how is Chinese language written? Chinese language uses a unique system of characters. There is no alphabet, so Chinese characters are logograms, which means that each sign, each character, is either a separate word or a meaningful part of a word. Most Chinese words consist of 2 characters. There are some 3-character words and more, but that is only for some loan words and foreign names. That's not very frequent. Chinese characters never blend or never change their form when they're put in a sentence. They consist of meaningful components, or at least components that had meaning at some point in the past, and components in their turn consist of strokes. The number of strokes is limited, so essentially all Chinese characters consist of a limited number of strokes, and Chinese language learners are usually advised to learn the stroke order when they learn to write a character. In the past, people would be writing in vertical columns from right to left, and some books are still printed this way for aesthetic purposes or to replicate the feeling of reading something really old. Those are very beautiful books, but normally Chinese are writing just the way most of the world does, that is, in horizontal lines from top to bottom, from left to right. There are no spaces between words in a Chinese text, but there are commas and full stops and some other punctuation marks. If we're speaking about typing Chinese characters on a computer, there are no special Chinese keyboards. Those do not exist. They use a standard English keyboard. You type the pronunciation of a character, and the system offers you several characters that fit this pronunciation, and you just pick the one that you need. On a smartphone, there is also an option of handwriting, but I think that pinyin input, that is transcription input, is much more common. How is Chinese language read? So as I've said, Chinese characters are logograms, that is, Each character is either a separate word or a meaningful part of a word, and the Chinese character has a pronunciation that to us looks like a syllable. You must learn the pronunciation of each Chinese character separately. There is basically no way to know how to read a character unless you specifically learned it. Chinese syllables are normally short. They start with a consonant and end with a vowel, with a few exceptions. So Chinese people usually struggle with pronouncing clusters of consonants. That is not common in their own language, and they usually struggle with it when they learn English. Is Chinese similar to Korean? I get this question a lot. No, Chinese and Korean are two different languages. They come from absolutely different language groups, which means that they have different pronunciation and different structure, different grammar. But Korea borrowed a lot of Chinese vocabulary due to historical processes, and Korea also used Chinese characters before inventing its own alphabet in the 15th century. But now the two languages are mutually unintelligible. A Chinese person does not understand Korean text and does not understand Korean by ear unless he learned it. Is Chinese similar to Japanese?
No, still no.
Same as Korean, Chinese and Japanese are two different languages. They come from two different language families, and thus they have different structures. Like Korean, Japanese borrowed a lot of vocabulary from Chinese, but that does not mean that the languages are similar. Also, Japanese uses a set of Chinese characters, so most likely a Chinese person will understand a little bit of a written Japanese text. He will recognize some characters, so he will know what the topic of the text is, but he will not know what is being said about this topic. He will not be able to say whether it's affirmative or negative, past or present, whether it's real or conditional. And that very limited understanding only works for written texts. The languages are unintelligible by ear. How old is Chinese language? By the age of a language, we usually mean the age of the oldest written records of it. The earliest examples of Chinese are inscriptions on the oracle bones from some 1200 BC in the Shang dynasty, so that makes Chinese over 3,000 years old. At the same time, for several reasons, there is a tendency to exaggerate the age of Chinese language, and you will easily find estimates of some 5,000 years old, but most serious researchers agree that it's somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500 years old, which already puts it on the top list of the world's most ancient languages. What is how are you in Chinese? 你好吗, which literally means are you well? And you may also hear from the older generation 你吃饭了吗? Which literally means have you eaten? How many dialects are there in the Chinese? This is a great question. So Mandarin Chinese was picked among several dialect groups to serve as the standard language, and this is the language that is taught in schools, that is used on TV, and that foreigners learn. But there are 9 other big subdivisions, big groups of dialects, in addition to Mandarin. The most popular of them is probably Yue or Cantonese. It is used in Hong Kong and Guangdong province of mainland China, and it is notorious for its 9 tones and traditional characters. So these groups differ mostly in pronunciation and partly in vocabulary. Grammar is pretty much the same. All of them have tones, but the number of tones grows in southern varieties. At the same time, these varieties are not homogeneous, and each of them further splits into dozens of local dialects that differ from village to village, from town to town, from county to county. They may be very similar in neighboring areas, but the differences grow with distance. So there is really no way to say where one dialect ends and the other begins, and thus there is no way to reliably count them. But there are definitely hundreds of different dialects, and each city, each town has its own hua, its own language. Shanghai has Shanghai-hua and Suzhou has Suzhou-hua. They both belong to one group of dialects, the Wu group, but they're still different, even though the cities are some 20 minutes apart by bullet train. So all in all, there are 10 big groups of dialects, including Mandarin, but each of them further splits into dozens of local speaks. So that was it. Please write your questions in the comment section below. I will be glad to answer them. And 谢谢大家耐心观看，下次再见，拜拜。